First of all, I just want to really thank you all for coming out. This is Washington, D.C. It's 10 o'clock in the morning. You are busy. It's also an environment where we have all kinds of fast and 147 character ways of absorbing information. So the thought that you have actually come to listen to a live kind of human being talking to you, I really appreciate it. It's really great to see you. And the second, two more brief introductory remarks. One is, do not put my book on hold at the library. As much as I love libraries, buy it. And the second is I have a special dispensation to warn you about this. We are going to be interrupted at approximately 10:30. There's going to be a drill. And what I'd like you to know is it's just a drill. We don't have to go outside. We can hang out here. So let's try to get through whatever the announcement is as kind of quickly and efficiently as we can so that, you know, we can continue what I hope is going to be a conversation and not just me talking to you. There are a couple of policy wonk versions of the thinking that I've been engaged in for a while out there, which you can pick up or can access on the Carnegie website. But I decided we're in a library, right? And it's a book talk. So let's not do this Washington style. Let's do this like reading style. And so that's how I'm going to approach this. But I just want to give you a little bit more about the kind of unusual trajectory that led me to this work. So I was a National Public Radio correspondent, covered the fall of the Taliban in southern Afghanistan, and it was actually President Karzai's uncle, who I had interviewed for some contextual background a couple of times, who basically popped a question, wouldn't you come back and help us? And I have a tendency to think with my mouth, and I did that, and the word that came out was yes, and then it was an effort to sort of figure out what that looked like. And quite ironically, what that looked like for the first couple of years was working for the Karzais, not people with a great reputation for public integrity, right? They're very, very sophisticated. And I have to confess to my chagrin that working for that family, interacting with Karzai brothers every day, just about, it still took me 2.5 years to see through them and to understand the delta that existed between what they were saying and what they were doing. And so although I can often come off as critical of how US interveners function in environments like this, mea culpa, right? I mean, it's really not easy. So I lived in downtown Kandahar, which was the Taliban heartland. I lived in a regular house, no barbed wire, no sandbags, for 8 years. And then I started working for the US government, and everybody in Kandahar knew that. And for whatever reason, I'm still breathing. So that's a kind of interesting background. And then, I mean, an interesting experience. And as Karen mentioned, I ended up working for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that was a vertically integrated experience like, you know, it's hard to imagine, because he is not a directive individual. Basically, my guidance was make a contribution. And I worked on how I could best do that. Occasionally, he would ask me for feedback, or fairly often on decisions or on input he was getting. But when I couldn't take Washington anymore, it was, boss, I'm going downrange. And he would basically say, be safe. And so although I was a federal government employee, I suppose it's probably not great that I'm sharing this, but I didn't function subject to normal USG security requirements because I lived there. I was going home, right, basically. So I was experiencing this war from a mud brick facility in Kandahar up to the Pentagon and basically all of the echelons in between. It was pretty mind-bending because the logics at all of these different echelons were quite different. Sometimes I would say, what happens inside the beltway? Do the birds start flying upside down and the leaves on the trees are blue? Or, you know, I mean, just the logic felt so unbelievably different. So it was a really interesting experience. In early 2010, we were trying to generate some kind of serious anti-corruption approach at ISAF command. At that point, I was working for General McChrystal. This is before I worked for Admiral Mullen. And we were really looking for a lowest common denominator, right? Like the most corrupt actors in the Afghan government. Let's have 3 soft courses of action. No accepting. There are 2 seats up here. If you guys, are you okay back there? If not, okay. No accepting gifts from them. No stature-enhancing interactions with them. Doesn't mean you can't work with them. It just means don't do it in such a way that they can then broadcast to their community that they've got you by their side. And third, no fancy boondoggle invitations, right, to stuff happening overseas. So we were fighting to get this established as sort of across-the-board policy. We failed, incidentally. But in the middle of that process, I find out that the counter-narcotics minister has been invited to the Marshall Center, which is a US facility. It's basically a military training facility in Germany, to give, for a counter-narcotics symposium. Of course, the guy is the biggest dope dealer in Afghanistan, and so I happen to have a friend at the Marshall Center, so, let's do this networked, right? If we can't do it by the rule of law, let's call up our friends, right? The criminals are networked, let's us get networked. So I called her up and I said, you got to turn this off. And she did, but then she was out of speaker. So, boondoggle? Hey. No, but I did offer her to fill in. And I gave a standard narcotics talk because I lived in Kandahar, right? The biggest opium producing region in the world. And I was which you'll hear about, but what I was doing at the time was running a manufacturing cooperative. So it was commerce, right? I mean, it was actually manufacturing. Skincare products. And we were using licit local agriculture. So I was in competition with opium for manpower. In May, I knew quite intimately how that economy worked, and it is an interesting. It's an economy, and there are structural reasons why people grow opium. It's not quite as simple as opium is more valuable than wheat. Anyhow, so I give this talk, and I just couldn't resist sticking in, and you might get subjected to them, a couple of slides at the end of the talk, which showed how the Afghan government was functioning as a vertically integrated criminal organization. It basically functions the way a mafia functions, with money being extracted from the bottom, being sent up in return for a promise of protection. And I just stuck that in there at the end as an afterthought because I just couldn't bear to only be talking about opium, because for me, opium was just a piece of the problem. That's not the central problem. That's just one revenue stream, and a big one, but one revenue stream that's being captured by this criminal organization. To my shock, the room kind of erupted, and people came down afterwards. We had 200 people, 250 people from 45 different countries, mostly law enforcement and military. And people came down and said, you just described my country. And I had Nigeria in the front of the line, and I had Central Asia, and I had the Balkans, and I'm looking and saying, every single one of these countries has a violent insurgency, religious insurgency. And for me, I had had my nose down the Afghanistan rabbit hole for the last 8 years. I didn't have a clue. I vaguely knew there's something called Boko Haram in Nigeria, but I was like, oh my God, there's a correlation here between acute corruption and violent extremism. This is early 2010. Then you get the Arab Spring. Then you get Ukraine. Then you get, And so what I want to say is, although my own deep experience is Afghanistan, this topic touches Ukraine, ISIS in Iraq, a lot of what's going on in the world today, security-wise. And so I'd love, as we do start talking, if we can not exclusively focus on Afghanistan, because I really find it's a pregnant idea. I'm not trying to say that corruption is the one and only cause of everything that's going wrong in the world, although I can be tempted, if you push me, I can be tempted to make that argument. But this really is, I think, an under-recognized factor in a lot of the security crises that we're going through. So with that lengthy introduction, let me just give you a taste of this. And I decided to choose a commerce-relevant passage here. Now living on the economy, trying to build a business in this outlandish environment, I came to experience corruption from a new angle, the receiving end. For 9 months, we attempted to register our cooperative, making weekly trips to the Provincial Department of Agriculture on the edge of town. But each time we would find the cooperative's director absent, or the registration forms were suddenly out of stock. At length, we were ready to dispatch our unflappable administrator, Pashtun Atif, to complete the last formality. He had to deposit a sum in the National Bank. Several of us and the 2 dogs trailed out into the street to see him off. An hour later, my cell phone rang. Not even Atif could keep the frustration from his voice. The bank clerk wanted a bribe. Atif and I strode over to our battered red pickup truck, incidentally a Taliban truck, which the Taliban had left with Ahmed Wali Karzai when they skipped town, and then he gave to me. So we got these perks, in Kandahar. Let's see. I clambered aboard and roared off to the bank. Atif and I joined forces outside and then went to find the impediment. The man had to sign 5 different receipts out of his little book, didn't I see? He paged through them. He would be needing 20 Afghanis each to do that, or a total of about $2. Fine, I replied with a sunny grimace. I'd be happy to give you the money. I extracted a crumpled bill from my pocket. The only thing is, I need a receipt. We have a board of directors. They look at our books. They demand amounts and accounts. The clerk snorted at the idea of a receipt for his bakshish. I suggested we talk it over with the manager. The 3 of us trooped into an office, and I explained the case. Delighted to give the man 100 Afghanis, but I needed a piece of paper to justify it to my board. The manager conceded it was a fair point, and we trooped back out. Come back tomorrow, the clerk commanded sullenly. The scene could have been plucked directly out of Polycraticus, John of Salisbury's 12th century mirror for Henry II. So let me give you a pause here and say, this is a bit of a ride. This is clearly not a policy wonk book, and there's a rather significant historical thread that weaves through it, including extracts from a body of literature that's called Mirrors for Princes. The most famous of those that we know is Machiavelli, right, The Prince. And these are manuals that churchmen or courtiers or sometimes kings themselves wrote for future kings or rulers who were sitting, and they are wonderful, and they are absolutely taken up with injunctions against corruption, and some of them are really quite amusing. So John of Salisbury writes, "If you're permitted to pay a visit to him, consider this great luck. If you have not brought your transit papers, you approach him in vain. Yet if you have brought them, it's still of no use, for he will not acquiesce to dishonor noble hands with your vile parchment. What more? It's necessary to buy his efforts, since neither work nor pen nor the various inks come without a price. If you do not make him favorable to you, he will so twist the very syllables and strokes of the letters as to write war for peace and quarrel for quiet. If perhaps a handsome belt is yours, or a suitable knife, or anything else in the way of attractive small possessions, count it among his goods, if you do not wish to lose all of your trouble and expense. For it will be wrung from you by direct requests if you do not forestall these by your own generosity." I'm not sure I can reconstruct the physics of what happened next. Suddenly, I was seated cross-legged atop the man's desk, amid the file folders and the stray papers, severe faces stapled passport size to some of their corners. "Okay," I declared. "I'll just sit here till you sign for our money." I folded my arms across my chest. "As long as it takes." After a stunned second, a bustle commenced. The man got up from his chair. 10 minutes later, another clerk delivered our booklets, duly signed and stamped. Atif and I thanked him, and descended the stairway, trying not to exult too openly. We had won. We had obtained an administrative service without giving in to corruption. But something about that encounter has bothered me ever since. Another man had been waiting with us most of the morning. He was a weathered old graybeard in a turban and a tunic, perched on one of the black vinyl chairs with a heel tucked under him, out of long habit of sitting cross-legged on the ground. Like us, almost done here. Then we can make this more interactive. Like us, he was trying to accomplish some formality. He had paid his bribe, 10 Afghanis, I think he told us, but he was still waiting. And I hadn't done a thing to help him. As a foreigner, I could afford to bluster and bluff. A lowly bank employee was unlikely to take the risk of dragging an American to jail or smacking her in the face. That creased old Afghan farmer had no such standing. On this and later occasions, I let officials treat me as an exception. I'd get my problem solved, the concern of most businesses operating in acutely corrupt environments, and then go away, leaving the system unbolstered by a bribe, but also unchecked. What impression must it have made on Afghans as they waded through a blistering afternoon in the dusty customs yard to see an American get preferential treatment at the hands of venal administrators? So, I have been working mostly in government on this issue, not so much with the private sector, but I know that the private sector is a really, really critical player in this whole dilemma. We have a fairly robust Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Sometimes businesses are a bit upset that the United States prosecutes them for bribing foreign officials while it bribes them itself, either in the form of bags of cash that the CIA supplies to President Karzai, or in the form of basically humanitarian assistance or foreign or military assistance provided almost explicitly in a pay-to-play kind of arrangement with foreign governments. So I think that's an issue that as a country we need to sort of grapple with. But I've been playing with the idea of how do we promote trade with a country like Nigeria, like Cameroon, like, Afghanistan? How do we, should we just be promoting trade without thought to how our investments may be facilitating and enabling the development of structures like this? And I think it's something that we all really need to think about, and obviously businesses are in it for the profit, but the notions of corporate social responsibility are growing, and it may be, I feel like there are two issues. One is risk. So as we talk a little bit further, I can get more specific about the connections that I see between acute corruption and security risk, and especially in capital-intensive investments, obviously like the extractive industries and things like that. You need to be, thinking quite long-term in terms of your risk horizon. And, Tunisia looked like a wonderful, stable, strong state until it wasn't, right? And so these types of governments have fragilities in them that we may be underestimating. So there is, how do you really look at risk? But secondly, reputational risk and corporate responsibility. So reputational risk, it's now not so easy to make clothes in, basically slavery conditions in Bangladesh or wherever it might be. It's still sort of possible, but consumers are starting to get a little bit more hip to this. And the question is, would consumers start getting more hip to, wow, the president of Nigeria has stolen between 10 and $20 billion in the last, 2 years. 10 and $20 billion. Imagine the human cost that has. And oh, by the way, why is Boko Haram so pissed off? It doesn't look, when they attack villagers, it doesn't really look like this has anything to do with corruption, but I would argue that it does. So if you're investing in a pay-to-play arrangement in a country like this, you as a business are also facilitating and enabling this kind of a system with all of the repercussions that might have on the population, on the citizenry. And so, you as consumers may start eventually to wake up to that issue too. And finally, I would just say, so here's are we good to go? Great. So I would also say our foreign policy is very heavily affected by our businesses and our business interests. In other words, US corporations are conducting a very significant amount of US foreign policy, whether they know that or are conscious of that or not. They are. And in that regard, their own perceptions of what corporate social responsibility ought to entail could do with just a little bit of expansion. And I would submit that that might be a message that the Commerce Department, could begin to start at least playing with as you all engage in how we as a country invest and trade with our foreign partners. So with that sort of introduction, I'd love to turn this into much more of a conversation. Again, I think you're going to need to speak into a microphone just for the purposes of the recording here. Yeah, in the back there. A microphone is coming.
Could you describe for us a success story in putting an end to corruption any place in the world?
There are, success stories are difficult to, they're always ambiguous, right? But there are some interesting cases. Very often, what needs to happen is really serious attention to it from the top. So Peru is one. Fujimori eventually left, but then you had the chief prosecutor in Peru put most of his government in jail. And that allowed for a pretty thoroughgoing reform of the Peruvian government. Indonesia is an interesting case. South Korea. It took quite some time, but South Korea is a very different looking place today than it was in the 1950s. Rwanda is a very complex case because it's quite authoritarian, but compared to its neighbors, in terms of economic corruption, you just don't see it. Not anything like the same level. I guess my feeling in terms of how we as Americans need to interact with this, I've got sort of two remarks. One is that in Afghanistan, we were, for all intents and purposes, we were the government. And the notion that we weren't was really a fantasy that we were telling ourselves. But Afghans certainly never believed that. And so there's a whole riff in this book about the notion of command responsibility, that you are responsible for the actions of your subordinates. And from the perspective of Afghan citizens, the Afghan government was our subordinate. And interestingly, that didn't bother them as much as we think it did. The issue for Afghans was not that the Karzai government was bad because it was associated with us. That wasn't the issue. It went the other way around. We became increasingly discredited because of our association with the government that was behaving badly. So basically, Afghans, and I went into Kandahar, the Taliban heartland, on December 9th or 10th of 2001, right? Literally on the heels of the Taliban. And I never in a decade received any hostility from the Kandahar population. There was no, I'm not saying people were throwing their hats in the air. It's a very sober kind of town, but Kandaharis, it was also Ramadan and stuff, so you can't really, the celebration happened at the end of Ramadan, but Kandaharis were looking to us to bring a government that I don't want to use the word democracy because it's so loaded, but to which they had input, so that was listening to their concerns and their aspirations, one. Two, that applied the rule of law equally across people of different status. That's what they were looking for us from. And oh, by the way, doing that without it being a religiously ideological government. This is what they wanted in Kandahar. They're very devout and practicing Muslims, but Kandaharis were not ideological. That is not at all what I experienced. All of that's a little bit counterintuitive. So in a place like Afghanistan, where we have all of the levers, right? That government is on life support that we're providing. There was no reason for the US government not to use some of that leverage. Now, that's a really different situation from the situation with, let's say, Nigeria, which is a country that, is very self-sufficient because of oil revenues, doesn't particularly need us, and certainly knows how to play up the not needing us. And I think that's a really interesting phenomenon that I discovered. There's a great monograph written in 1972 about Vietnam. It's called Bureaucracy Does Its Thing. It's a RAND thing. It's by a guy called Comer, K-O-M-E-R. You can find it online. It's brilliant. You just substitute any of these government acronyms for GVN, and you've got the situation today, which is a weak government, a weak client state government that is able to leverage its weakness way better than we figure out how to leverage our strength. So I watch us, or the UK in a country like Nigeria, terrified of being denied access to Nigerian ministers or whatever if we're mean and call them on corruption. I'm like, what? How is it that we're in a position of begging for access to venal members of the Nigerian government? How does this happen? And I talked with Brits about this, where a British friend of mine, you know, was waiting for a meeting with a Nigerian minister, and the guy is keeping him waiting for like 2 hours, right? And my friend is saying, I was really tempted to get up and leave. And I'm like, why didn't you? And he said, we just are not, you know, our embassy doesn't really want us to do this. And interestingly, a friend of his, who had been in the High Commission but moved over to work for the European Union, had the same thing happen to him. And he said, at the end of 45 minutes, I got up and left. This was a governor. And I said, you know, and then, you know, the staff gets into a tizzy. You can't go, you can't go. And he says, no problem. The governor's obviously busy, and I don't want to add to the pressure on him. So, you know, next time I'm in the state, I'll come see him. Well, by God, they fell all over themselves. The governor called him, you know, deep apologies, blah, blah, blah. It's sort of like the marketplace, right? How do you seal a deal in the bazaar? You walk away from it. And so I feel as though we have lost the, what's the word, the kind of skill, the subtlety of how you use the type of power that, frankly, we still have as the United States of America. I'll tell you just one other little anecdote. Sorry, these are long answers. In terms of how messages are communicated subtly, the governor of Afghanistan, and this, the governor of Kandahar, and this goes back to 2003, was irritated with me because I was outspoken. And so intelligence came into the CIA, which had a substation in Kandahar, to the effect that, you know, an active cell of something or other was targeting Sarah Chayes, blah, blah, blah. So the CIA calls me in and, you know, warns me and stuff like that. Meanwhile, I was good friends with the Kandahar police chief, and I was also pretty good friends with military intelligence. So I go to, you know, US DIA folks. So I go to DIA, the DIA guy, and I said, have you heard any? He says, he runs his traps, and he says, no current threat matrix against any named person or individual in Kandahar. Talk to my police chief friend who's got people all over town. Nothing going on. So I'm like, sounds like the governor. And so the interior minister, who was also a friend of mine, was meeting Jack Straw in Kandahar, big lunch. He invites me to the lunch. The governor's at the lunch, blah, blah, blah. And after lunch, the interior minister and the governor are sort of closeted off, chatting. And the interior minister calls me over. He says, Sarah, how's your security? And I said, fine, everything's great, you know. And the governor's a sort of hefty guy, and the interior minister pokes him in the stomach and says, Sarah, if you ever have any issues, security issues, here's your man. He'll make sure you're safe. That was his way of saying, don't touch her. But it's very subtle, right? It's done in this really diplomatic way. And I raised that just because I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great if we knew how to do stuff like that? So that was a very long answer to that question. Any other thoughts? Right over here?
You mentioned, since you're speaking to a commerce audience, and that a number of us here do trade facilitation work for U.S. companies. Could you elaborate on what you would like us to be sort of mindful of in this?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So among the policy wonk documents that are up front or available is something called Corruption, the Priority Intelligence Requirements. So it turns out, as I've been doing this work, we had a pretty high-level workshop or kind of roundtable, whatever, at Carnegie, in which were two very, very senior intelligence professionals. And they had to confess that this is not a target for intelligence collection or analysis. We are not looking at these countries systematically. And so, to some extent, you as commerce suffer from that lack of attention on the part of our intelligence community. Because if you think about these governments not so much as governments, but rather as criminal networks, then you need to analyze them as criminal networks. It means you need to map them as networks and figure out, okay, who are the key nodes and what are the levers of power that are being used to both coerce the population, coerce the economic, almost distort the economy, because that's what they're doing. They're distorting the economy. And what are the key revenue streams that they are capturing? So I would say, as you're facilitating trade, what you don't want to do is be the first thing you don't want to do is say, you know what, if you get the kleptocrats on your side, you'll be able to do your trade, right? Which is a real temptation. It's, and I'm not saying that you would ever encourage anyone to bribe them, but, you need to be on the right side of so-and-so because let's take Uzbekistan. So in Uzbekistan, up until very recently, Gulnora Karimova, the daughter of Karimov, owned the communications sector. So if you wanted to invest in a cell phone network in Uzbekistan, it was pay to play. And camouflaged, of course, in ways that would probably get around the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but that's what you had to do. Now, there are two reasons that you as commerce wouldn't want to encourage US companies to get involved in something like that. One is that once you've paid at the toll booth, all bets are off, right? Because that's not a legal toll booth, and you have signaled your willingness to submit yourself to extra legal, basically, extraction. So there's a great interview with a guy, and it's in there, who was involved in a telecoms company, and he said, every once in a while, all of the routing stations would go down. And we would have, 300,000 or, irate customers, right? Like writing to us saying, where's the signal, where's the signal, where's the signal? And we would hear that we would have to make a contribution to a charity that, oh, by the way, is held by Gulnora Karimova. And we would, and it would be $500,000, it would be a couple $100,000, $500,000, something like that. And then, bang, the stations will go back up. So you open yourself, so on a strictly business side of things, once you engage in pay to play, all bets are off and you can be just, and then eventually they'll just take your business over. When they decide it's healthy enough that they want it, they'll take it. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that you don't, again, from a responsibility perspective, you really don't want to be facilitating and enabling this kind of a system. And as the US government, as I have spoken to business executives, what they say is we take our cues from the US government. So if the State Department says it's okay to, invest here, or if commerce is helping us invest in this environment, we assume that that is in harmony with US national interest and foreign policy priorities. So I think you guys actually have to assume a bit more of that kind of vetting responsibility. And I also think my understanding of the intelligence community is they do what their clients ask them to do. So you guys can be part of the process of getting the intelligence community more switched on to these issues by asking the questions. So when you have businesses that are interested in investing in Uzbekistan, ask for a read on what are the corruption implications of this, this industry in Uzbekistan. And oh, by the way, can you map me how the industry slots into the governing, the government structure or the sort of parallel government structure, because very often, as we all know with beneficial ownership, it's Gulnora, but she's not an independent operator. I mean, she's not a private citizen, right? She's the daughter of the president, of the dictator of the country, so she's obviously wired in. But very often it's cousins or in-laws or something like that. If you guys ask for that mapping, that forces the intelligence community to start looking at it. And that then provides you with the type of information that you can really be helpful with when you're interacting with private sector. The other final thing that I would say on that is these guys are really sophisticated. And one of the things that this was something that I fell for completely, one of the things they're really good at doing is when there's a foreigner who's unfamiliar with the environment, unfamiliar with the language, unfamiliar with the culture, unfamiliar with the reality of the power dynamics, they set themselves up as your fixer. And they get everything done for you. And you want, a mushroom sandwich at 10 o'clock at night, you want T-walls, you want, gravel, you got it, then and there. They do everything 24/7 to get you what you need. And then meanwhile, they have monopolized the position of being your intermediary with the rest of the community. Therefore, they become the paywall. And I let this happen for like 2.5 years. It took me a really long time to figure my way out of it. So again, it is so tempting because the guys speak not only English, but they got your vocabulary down, they're sympathetic, and so that's a piece, like a word to the wise that I would have you all pass on to companies that are functioning in these environments is beware of the absolutely perfect fixer. Because then they are acting in your name and what they do reflects on you to the population. There's a question right here.
Hi, thank you. Catherine Nickerson. I'm an attorney here at the Commerce Department.
Great.
And we work on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Fantastic.
And we worked on the Foreign Bribery Convention at the OECD to make sure that our trading partners do the same thing. And rest assured, we also train our foreign service officers, commercial service, and at the State Department on the FCPA, and they have reporting requirements if they do run into the kind of situations you're talking about with businesses bribing. But one of the questions I had for you, you said on CSR, which we also work on, and we provide actually guidance to the business community on compliance programs. You said it could be expanded. So what more do you think we can do as far as businesses in their own programs? Because we have put out guidance in APEC and the OECD on those things. Thank you.
So I'd like to actually pick up on foreign corrupt practices too, just for a second. 2 points. One is, literally, I was getting texts as I was coming over here from a friend who was reading a monograph on the history of the law, who said, what it appears to be is this was initially a political law. It was because it was reflecting badly on the United States. It was creating foreign policy problems for us when our businesses were bribing. And so that's a partial answer to your second question, which is, whoops, please resume. We did already, sorry. I think that you guys, how to put this, we're a country built on ideals. That's unique. We get confused about those ideals. Sometimes we get confused about whether those ideals stop at the water's edge or not, right? In my view, those ideals are sorry to sound really, right? But that's why I'm proud to be an American. And that means each and every one of us is really responsible for reinforcing and upholding those ideals, and particularly those of you who work in the US government. And that means when you're talking about CSR, there's no reason that you shouldn't say, hey, This has, almost in the terms I just used, this has much broader implications. US foreign policy is not only being run by the Department of State or the NSS. You guys are representatives of the United States of America, and you are impacting how the world works. So as responsible members of the global community, you know, your bottom line cannot be the only motivation in how you conduct yourself overseas. I mean, I think there may be room to make that point. One last just return to corrupt practices. The issue for me with corrupt practices is it's only aimed at the bribe payers. So as a lawyer working these cases, I would start thinking about how do you bust that wedge open a little bit further? How do you maybe include, if you're doing a settlement, for example, on a case, how do you make as part of the deal that they have to inform on the bribe takers? They have to start providing evidence on the bribe takers, which you could then pass across to the kleptocracy unit at DOJ. And in particular, this is pie in the sky, but my notion of how the US ought to be approaching these issues when you've got a really serious case like a Nigeria or like a, first of all, it's concentrate our efforts, right? There's always a tendency to sort of go for the easy case, that you can make the case, but then you're not making an impact. You're making a case, but you're not making an impact. To make an impact, you need to first of all, decide, based on, I think, security implications, political trade-offs, and whatever the other considerations might be, what are the 3 or 4 countries that we ought to really be focusing on? And then let's let you focus your cases on those countries, right? Right? I mean, let's select cases based on not the ease of making them or the quantity of evidence that you just happen to have right now, but let's focus our effort on, you know, a couple of countries that on an interagency level have been chosen as really significant ones. And then let's map, on those countries, let's map the kleptocratic network, right? And then you say, okay, who are the key nodes? Treat it really like organized crime. You're going to take it down by working up that network from node to node. So then let's develop our foreign corrupt practices cases around suspected bribe takers, you know, that we want to start hitting. That's ambitious, I know, but I think that this, you know, damn, you guys are the United States government, right? I mean, there's some resources there. I know in this day and age it feels really limited, your resources, but all the more reason to channel them in a targeted fashion. There's one over there. There's a second, but let's try to get the first, but we'll come back to you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah, for this great talk. I first wanted to just respond to this gentleman's question you asked about a country that had turned around corruption, or a success case. And I just want to mention last week in the New Yorker, there is an article about corruption that mentions Sarah's book. But it starts off with the example of Singapore. Yep. As a place that was radically transformed. I don't know how Singapore is today, but it told briefly the account of how that happened. So you might want to look that up.
Yeah, thank you very much for that.
But I had a question. So I lived in Afghanistan in the 70s under the king for a while, hitchhiking back and forth across the country, and and other things, living in Kabul. And within a week or so, I or any other drug-addled hippie could have told you, or anyone, that the government was one and the same or tightly connected to the dope economy, and two, that that Afghanis, although very poor, as you say, are very sly and sophisticated. And three, there was an extremist right-wing component even then that Afghanis called fascists at the time. And 4, I think if anyone had asked anyone else there who only knew the country in this very simple way from just being there, what would happen if you poured billions of dollars into this dirt poor economy, anyone would have said it would get ripped off. So I'm wondering, given all that, I guess I have a hard time understanding. Okay, there was the giving all the cash in the bags to Karzai. Somehow that's in our interest. But I don't understand, and maybe you could shed some light on this, the lattice work of corruption as far as contractors and subcontractors, taxpayers on this end being told about all this infrastructure that was going to be built in the radical transformation of the country towards democracy. And when that wasn't happening year after year after year, the money being sent to the United Arab Emirates in people's pockets, okay, it is, as you say, difficult to end corruption, but why did the money continue?
Right.
And from what I know just from the media, it seems there was no one overseeing the money. So as a taxpayer, I can't help but resent that my money was squandered. So would you talk about that, please?
Yeah, I want to pick up on a couple of things here. First on Singapore, and it actually connects. The part of your question I didn't answer is that just because there are relatively few cases, there are cases, but they are admittedly relatively few, of a highly corrupt country turning around, doesn't absolve us as the United States of America and the United States government from its responsibility not to actively facilitate the crystallization of corruption networks. And the degree to which we can reverse policies that have done that, such that they actually provide supporting fires to local civil society activists or populations who are trying to, trying to change this, I feel like it's our duty as the United States to do that. Whereas, when we are paying $1 billion a year, Ching to Mubarak every single year, it's pretty difficult for Egyptians to feel like they've got any leverage. And similarly with Afghanistan, the notion that Afghans could stand up in a nonviolent way against the corruption of the Karzai government, given the gigantic support that everything we did provided and appeared to provide, is just, I think, unrealistic. So that comes to precisely your question. First of all, and again, your preamble, the 1970s preamble, is very interesting, but I think you would still concede that there was a government that functioned, and this was not a wild and woolly, ungovernable, tribal society that, our fantasies, we kind of like to describe Afghanistan that way, and we forget that throughout most of the 20th century, it was one of the best governed countries in the region. Now, was it perfect? Of course not, but, we got a lot of drugs on the streets, less now, but we've been through a period when there was a lot of dope on the streets of America too. So again, I'm not trying to make a comparison here. I'm just saying that Afghanistan in the 60s and 70s was a very different type of place than either it is today or that the typical narrative describes it as. Is that fair? Yeah. And then, the second thing on your preamble I'd like to say is the next time I come up here to talk to you, in about 3 or 4 years probably, it will be a book on the Kabul Bank, which was sort of a microcosm of our financial meltdown. And I want to use that book as an opportunity to talk about some of these broader issues, in particular what you say about the flood of money. And the flood of money isn't just about the number of dollars, and often that's how it was described in the development community was, wow, we poured more dollars into Afghanistan than Afghanistan could absorb. And so the expression is absorption capacity. But I have wanted to go a little bit deeper and think about the culture of money. And here we are in the Commerce Department, right? But money obviously is a very important facility. We all need it. There is a question, though, about what happens when money becomes almost the preeminent or overarching or most important value. Societies and cultures are kind of organisms that select and promote ideals that their members ought to strive for and ought to try to live up to. They promote ideals that make us willing to take risks, to cause, to expend effort to achieve, right? And when money's a really powerful one of those. And so in the early 2000s, you had America, which was at its absolute peak of fascination with money and deregulated banking and stuff like that, crashes into Afghanistan, which, think about it, 2002, right? Where we were incubating the meltdown right then through deregulating banks, the notion that the market regulates itself, that what we need to do is remove the kind of crippling fetters that we've got on this brave new world of finance. And we go to Afghanistan where there are no banks. There is a traditional money transfer system called Hawala, but there are no banks. And we decided that banks are intrinsically good and Hawalas are intrinsically bad because terrorists used them. And of course, terrorists use them. Everybody used them. I used them. That's how I transfer money around Afghanistan, because it works, right? So what we did was create a banking sector without regulation. And so the criminal hawaladars became criminal bankers, and that made them even more powerful criminals because then they had SWIFT codes. And let me take you just a little bit further down the culture road here and say that money is really an interesting thing, because to serve as a means of exchange, it needs to be basically indistinguishable from itself, small, portable, lightweight, ideally invisible, as we're getting to now. That's how money functions best as a vehicle for transferring value. However, money also serves the purpose of proving success, right? I mean, let's think about the Crow Indians, right? They would show their prowess by stealing horses from the Sioux. And so you would have bands of Crow that had 1,000 or 2,000 horses, right? They didn't need that many horses, but that's how they showed that they were successful. So we accumulate money to show that we're successful. The problem is, if money's invisible, accumulating it doesn't really show much of anything, right? So in order to prove that you're successful via money, you need to spend it. You need to spend it to buy things that basically only prove that they cost money, like Rolex watches or philanthropy or, right? Or international assistance. I mean, in a funny way, culturally, we are wired to spend money as a sign of prowess. Meanwhile, Afghanistan was founded on a theft. In 1747, a guy was the cavalry captain for the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran got assassinated. He decided he was not going to fight over succession in Iran. I mean, it wasn't Iran, it was Persia, it was, but he decided he was going to go back to Afghanistan and do something. And he knew that there was a caravan of tribute that was on its way from India. And he intercepted it and captured it. And that is the founding of Afghanistan. And so you have these two cultures where one of them shows its prowess by stealing money, albeit stealing it from powerful people, and one that shows its prowess by spending money. Put the two of those together and you have a perfect storm, right? Now that's a slightly more philosophical answer than I think you were looking for. The more policy answer is that our foreign assistance is, you are promoted based on dollars you get out the door. You're not promoted based on money you don't spend. It's an incentive structure within our own society. Now our own institutions. And everybody I know at USAID hates this. And yet that is still the incentive structure within our institutions, partly because Congress won't vote your budget again if you haven't spent it. So you got to spend the money so that you can prove that you need it, which is ridiculous. And I have spent so much time trying to show people how not spending money in specific situations often achieves a greater U.S. policy outcome, a better U.S. policy outcome than spending the money. We now have a terrific inspector general with a gigantic staff, so I've sometimes wondered how much money is going into his efforts, but he's doing really great work. He comes out of the oversight community in Congress, and he's called SIGAR, and he is hammering this stuff. The problem is he doesn't have any enforcement power. I mean, he can bring cases, right? You know, he can prosecute, but he can't affect policy except by making noise, and it's not getting very far. So the short answer to your question is beats the hell out of me. You did have a further question, yeah.
Have you worked with Transparency International?
I have.
Could you tell us a bit about their role in trying to eliminate corruption?
Yeah, so Transparency, I don't know them very well. They clearly have the brand, right? And so I made a kind of marketplace decision that if I'm in this, you know, I had been doing this stuff in the field until about 2 years ago, when I'm doing it in this form, and I realized, look, you gotta get with these people who have an incredible track record and stuff like that. They are large, so a couple of points. One is the security argument, completely alien to them. I could not believe it. I co-organized a workshop on this whole topic a year ago, December, where I thought I almost didn't have to make the argument, and we would basically be planning the campaign. And with a TI, very senior, he was one of the founders of it, you know, he came into my office like 2 weeks before this thing's gonna go, and he's like, where is the part on the agenda for this thing where we talk about why it's a security threat? And I was like, it was so obvious to me that I was taking it for granted. I still thought, okay, we're gonna do, like, the first day we'll be exploring this argument, and then we'll get to the campaign, right? Well, I'll be darned, they couldn't figure it out. They don't think in security terms. And so they keep thinking about, you know, the economic impacts, what is called the human security impacts, that somebody is deprived of health care, you know, and so they become ill, or they're injured and they die because they don't have access to decent health care because of corruption in the health ministry, for example. That's how they think about it. It's like, you could just hear the gears grinding when you ask Transparency and other of the NGOs in the anti-corruption world to think in these terms. And the other thing that was really interesting was they kept saying, what's the difference between what you're talking about and failing, you know, fragile or failing states? And I said, Tunisia in 2009 was not a fragile or a failing state, nor was Egypt. So you gotta get, you know, and that brings me to the index. The index is a really interesting tool. It gets everybody, the Corruption Perceptions Index, gets everybody focused on corruption one day a year, and it's, you know, and it's sexy for journalists who, you know, like to cut corners and don't have a lot of time to. The problem is, it's almost self-referential. It's based on perceptions. And so how do people come to perceive of a country as being corrupt? Because people say it's corrupt. And so it becomes a kind of, that's part of it. And then, so Tunisia in 2009 or 10 was way up in the middle, because basically it was quite predictable corruption. The people whose opinions were being requested were largely international business, who had figured out how to work the pay-to-play thing, right? Or had figured it out. Or also, apparently, the implementer on the ground was someone wired into the ruling family. So that index, I think, is a really problematic index. It is not useful as a real objective measure of the degree or intensity of corruption in a country. My work, and I actually didn't go to the slides, which I'll do just quickly after this question, just to give you a sense of, my work's really qualitative. It's really been hard for me to figure out what numbers can I crunch to tell this story. But you know, we live in a data world, so I'm still working on that, and I would love some interaction with you guys. But I've been looking for what are the objective measures that what are things that you could count that would tell this story that aren't people saying it's corrupt? So one that's useful is UNODC has a bribery survey, and that is literally asking people how many times did you have to pay a bribe this year? So that's a concrete measure rather than and they're estimating the amounts. So Afghanistan, for example, $2 to $5 billion a year. This is not chump change. This is serious money that you could add. So here, back to your question, here we are spending $11 billion a year to build the Afghan security forces. We're hearing about how Afghanistan needs all this foreign input. Afghanistan is choosing not to collect its own revenues. And that means income taxes that people are obviously paying the equivalent of in bribes. And it means customs revenues. It's ridiculous. That has got to be $10 to $20 billion a year in customs revenue that is lost because the governors are putting it in their pockets. And again, as you know, our fiduciary duty over all of our taxpayer money, you know, would imply that we need to make some demands of Afghanistan in return for this money that we're pouring in there. So TI, so there are a couple of other outfits that I think have better measures. One is the World Justice Project. Again, it's not a vertical ranking. They have a kind of it looks almost like a spider web because it's got several different measures that all together add up to governance. And then 0 is in the middle and 1 is on the outside. So if you're good, you're closer to 1 on that measure. And if you're bad, you're closer to 0. So what you get is a kind of spiky line going around the circle. The problem is they're so rigorous about their data that they literally can't cover some of the worst offenders in the world because they just don't have good enough data. But that's one. There's also global financial integrity, which is very, very conservative on illicit financial flows, but that's a pretty good one. Why don't I just run you guys quickly through, I'm not going to go through all of them, but just give you a sense of these slides that I mentioned. And I guess I have a kind of clicker. So this is my very schematic diagram of what, you know, like a happy government, our government, right, looks like, which is you tax, I bet there's a thing, right, which of course doesn't show up, so I'm just going to do it this way. You tax the peeps, right? The money goes up to the top, and it's sent downwards in the form of the great salaries you guys all enjoy, right? And public goods like infrastructure, education, you know, and so on. Afghanistan, which is often called a patronage country, what's interesting is this also could describe a patronage system because resources are being distributed downwards within the system. Afghanistan runs like this. What's really critical is to see the money is going upwards. You got the donor money coming in that you were talking about. A lot of it bounces right back off. I mean, as much as we've poured in, a heck of a lot of that is coming back to us in the form of ridiculous salaries for the implementers in country, the security contracts, blah, blah, blah. But a huge amount of money, as I said, $2 to $5 billion is being extracted from the people, and it gets sent up. I mean, to get a job in the police, to be district police chief, it costs $50,000 plus a monthly cut, right? So people, who wants to be a police chief in Afghanistan? Are you kidding? Obviously, this is a really lucrative business. The traffic cops in Kandahar, I was friends with them because, you know, they're all over the city. So you want, you know, your friends all over the city. They rent their street corners because some are more profitable than others. What goes down in return, permission to extract resources any way you want. So the governor of Nangarhar province, which has got a great border post, he, you know, can shake down trucks coming into Afghanistan however he wants. That's the deal. Secondly, protection from repercussions. And there's a lot of explanation of that in the book as we tried to mount some anti-corruption efforts, and we watched Karzai turn himself inside out to protect really trivial people. And of course, punishment of positive actors. So what you have is an organism that is selecting for criminality just the way a mafia does. And that's why it got worse over time, because more and more positive actors were sloughed off, killed or expelled or whatever, while more and more criminals were being promoted based on how effective criminals they were, because the guys on top want more of a take, right? And that also explains why government personnel were deployed in certain places and not in others. You're deployed where there's a revenue stream. So I experienced a very hyper-present Afghan government, whereas people who were out looking for al-Qaeda in the middle of nowhere, they saw no Afghan government. Well, right, because there's no money out there. And so the system kind of organizes itself that way. I'll just show you a couple others. Oh, sorry, this explains how it leads to insurgency, right? We are the enforcers of that system. The people are pissed off, and their rage is channeled to asymmetric violence. Tunisia, really interesting. This is Ben Ali's Tunisia, really interesting role of the private sector here. The banks were giving non-reimbursable loans to cronies and people who wanted to be cronies. Basically, they were a piggy bank. You got free money unless you refused to give the ruling family its cut of the take. Then suddenly your loan would become due. Taxes were the same way. And I talked to a tax collector, and he said, you know, people's files would get put on the bottom of the pile. They didn't get thrown away. They were put on the bottom of the pile. And that meant that, you know, when somebody wanted a piece of your action, if you didn't give it, you had an audit and you were dead. I mean, overnight you were dead. You know. So that, for me, was the really interesting. It was the whole bureaucracy was put at the service of the kleptocratic system. In Egypt under Mubarak, there were two separate ones, and that helps explain the developments we've seen in Egypt. There was the military kleptocracy, and they own a gigantic proportion of the economy, but for whatever reason, Egyptians still see the military as a patriotic, you know, working in the national interest. There are some reasons why. They're a bit careful about how they steal the money and how they enjoy it. And then you had Gamal Mubarak, the son of Hosni, who came to Egypt in 1996, came back to Cairo to prepare his succession from a job where? At Bank of America in London. And he, you know, again, the sort of those types of approaches, privatization of state-owned enterprises into the hands of his cronies and so on. And that is what Egyptians blamed for the rising unemployment and things like that of the 2000s. Uzbekistan, similarly, cotton. The unique feature of the Uzbek system is forced labor. So you guys would all be working in the cotton fields for 2 or 3 weeks a year. Every government employee gets sent out to the cotton fields. Nigeria, the interesting difference in Nigeria, as with other resource countries, is that there is downward distribution within the system, a significant amount of downward distribution within the system, because there's so much money coming in at the top, particularly prior to elections and things like that. As I was researching this, I told you about the historical rift. The other part of the historical rift was looking at the rise of constitutionalism as a kind of anti-corruption measure, right? You know, Dutch Revolt, English Civil War, American Constitution. I drag you guys through all that. It's pretty interesting. And I stopped at some point. I said, wait a second. These guys are all Protestants. Like, what's in the water that Protestants drink? I don't get this. And so I decided I better go back to the source. So I started reading Martin Luther. Oh boy, it's all about corruption. Now again, I don't want to try to say there was no spiritual content to the Protestant Reformation, but if you look at the doctrinal issues that Martin Luther fixated on, you will find that they're toll booths. All of them are the places where the Catholic Church had a toll booth and was extracting money from people. And if there is a violent religious extremist movement, it sure as heck was the early Protestant Reformation. So I do a little bit of provocative comparison between, you know, stuff like Osama bin Laden and John Locke, So bear with me when you get to those chapters. But there was enough material there's a whole also body of literature which were the grievances of the German people against Rome, right around, in the early 16th century. There was enough detail for me to develop that version of my chart. And the one I'll leave you with, this is a very rough picture of significant security events related to corruption around the world since 2008. It's pretty significant. I get arguments about whether China counts, but when I hear that there are 100,000 demonstrations a year against corruption and its impacts, I start to say, hey, that's popular. So the yellows are nonviolent popular protest. The dark red is regime change or war. Serious violence due to corrupt alliances with transnational crime, which we haven't really gone into much here. Insurgency or coup, electoral violence, and then where you get stripes is where it's both. So with that, I think I should probably release you. Thank you very much again for coming out. This was really great.